This week's anime was Princess Mononoke, a movie which heavily and pretty directly talks about the ideas of nature and technology, as well as the balancing act that humanity needs to perform in order to live in harmony with nature. But I think that's a topic that's been talked about to death, because whenever people talk about this film, it's always the first and usually the only thing they seem to mention. But because the film hits this idea on the head so hard, and because I don't want to be the 800th video on YouTube talking about the very obvious meaning of the story, I wanted to take a slightly different route and instead talk about San, as well as the idea of humans being raised by animals in general. Before we get into this video though, if you are enjoying these weekly dives into anime series and movies, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content in the future. It really does help out and makes a massive impact for the channel. And speaking of the future, we had another 80% vote this week, so the next anime we're going to be watching is Made in Abyss, which is one of my personal favorites, so I'm extremely excited to talk about it. As for the following week, we'll give Link Click one more chance. Again, it's a story where our protagonist can re-experience the lives captured in photographs and use that ability to help others. Or we could watch Iroduku, The World in Colors, which follows a girl living in a black and white world filled with magic who meets this artist who can bring color into her life. So we have Link Click, a mystery series I love, and Iroduku, one which I've been dying to watch and which looks incredibly inspiring. So as always, check out the community tab on the channel to vote for which you want to see. With all that out of the way though, let's talk about San. When San was still a baby, the wolf goddess Moro found her parents destroying the forest and attacked them. They threw their child at Moro's feet and ran away. From here, rather than eating the baby, Moro decided to take it into her family and named her San, as she is now Moro's third child. This places San in a pretty unique situation. Raised by wolves, she rejects her own humanity and thinks of herself as a wolf. However, despite how she sees herself, we see every other animal, the monkeys, the boars, and even the wolves, all recognize her as being human. Even so, most of them seem to embrace her as part of the forest once Moro claims her as her daughter. San's whole world revolves around the forest and sees the humans of Irontown, Eboshi especially, as the ultimate threat to her forest family's survival, and as such she aims to kill Eboshi and stop the spread of human destruction. It's only through building a connection with Ashitaka and making a new peace with the forest spirit that San is able to recognize that humanity has a good side to it as well, and that she's able to accept herself as human. Regardless of this understanding though, ultimately San still decides to keep her distance from humanity and continues to live in the forest, albeit now with an open door for Ashitaka and a hope that the rest of humanity has learned from their mistakes. San, in general, is a super interesting character. The idea of this girl taken in by the forest who becomes disconnected with her own humanity. I obviously drew parallels to Western films I was familiar with, like Tarzan or The Jungle Book. However, I think Mononoke definitely has a stronger sense of presenting the importance of both separation and collaboration with nature in order to create a harmony with it, as well as adding in the twist of technology's ability to be both a great blessing or a corrupting curse depending on how it's used, with each of our three main characters being San, Ashitaka, and Eboshi, representing nature, harmony, and humanity respectively. But as I said, I'm not trying to rehash the usual nature discussion, and instead I want to focus on San and people like her. The idea of humans being taken in by nature is one that pops up in movies from time to time, but this idea of what is called feral children actually has a pretty storied history. In terms of mythology, the most famous example for feral children would probably be Remus and Romulus, the twin brothers who founded Rome, who were raised by a wolf until they were found by a wandering shepherd. But this isn't just for movies and myths. Documentation of feral children appear in real life all throughout the last 400 years or so, where anytime it happened before that, the documentation is just kind of a bit spotty and it's hard to tell if it was a myth or a legend. One prominent example was in Hamelin, Germany in 1724, when a man emerged from the woods, walking on all fours and acting like a wild animal. The locals captured him and noticed that he preferred to eat animals and vegetables raw rather than cooked. He was incapable of speech, and he was unfamiliar with any form of civil society. The boy was ultimately brought to England and given the name Peter the Wild Boy, and interestingly enough, despite living for another 60 years in a very civilized society for the time, he would never be able to learn to speak. And this even carries on to the modern era as well. For example, an 8-year-old girl named Rokum Pingyeng disappeared along the jungle's edge in Cambodia in 1989, only to reappear 18 years later in 2007. Identified due to a scar on her back. Rokum was taken back into society, however by 2010, only 3 years later, it was apparent that she would be unable to learn the local language, and she found herself so unable to adapt to the new environment that she fled back into the jungle with only very few sightings of her ever since. And this idea of feral children trying to escape back into the wild is actually a pretty common one. And while neither of these cases really show off the idea of being raised by animals, like San had been or even like Tarzan, there are documented cases of people being raised by monkeys, wolves, dogs, bear, cattle, sheep, and even ostriches. If it is any kind of social animal, there is a non-zero chance that they could take in a human child or infant and raise them alongside their own. It definitely isn't common in the world, but it does happen from time to time, and Rokum's case in particular is very interesting, as she disappeared at the age of 8 rather than being abandoned as an infant. Why this is interesting is because depending on when a person becomes a feral child, their brain development could be in a totally different stage. For example, there is something known as the critical period of a child's development, between the ages of 1 and 3. These are the years where a child will latch onto things like language, the ideas of social structure and cohabitation, and many other basic functions of just living in a society. If a child is abandoned and isolated within that time period, it could be exponentially more difficult for them to readjust back into society, if possible at all. In many cases, children in this situation would even struggle to understand what attachment to other people would be like. All of this in contrast to Rokum, who might have been able to understand that, or who probably learned her own language when she was younger, and despite that still found it impossible to cope with the new world that she found herself in. And at this point, I should probably clarify that the term feral child both refers to children who are raised by animals, but also to those who live in severe isolation or who have been raised in captivity. A very famous example of the latter being the case of Jeannie in 1970. A pretty dark story that I don't particularly want to get into, but just know that the definition is more about people being raised without human interaction, and thus they lack social skills of any meaningful kind. In some cases, like that of Victor Averon, a feral child found in France around the turn of the 19th century, it was also stated that the idea of self was not there initially, and was only through years of living with other people that he started to become more self-aware and empathetic of those around him. Feral children face a number of different challenges when readjusting into modern society. If they walk on all fours, they might never really be able to learn to walk upright. Feral children might struggle to use toilets. They typically are unable to speak or learn any kind of language, and they often show very little interest in humans around them. Obviously, in a film like Mononoke, where San plays this role of the voice of the forest in some regards, it wouldn't really function well for the story if she was unable to speak, and rather the story seems to have this kind of universal language that both animals and humans can understand, or at least one where the more important animals are able to communicate with humanity. And in that way specifically, it can be a little bit hard to draw a parallel with her and other feral children. However, the idea of not recognizing herself to be human and identifying as a wolf despite clearly having very different features to her adopted family does kind of lean into this concept of lacking self-awareness that you might have seen with Victor of Averon. I know that San being a feral child isn't exactly the focus of Princess Mononoke, and it definitely would have made more sense to talk about the environment, but I really wanted to try and talk about this movie in a way that many other people might not, or that might not have been done at all. And hopefully sharing that kind of interesting part of human history and sociology alongside the topic of this movie made for something you enjoyed watching. Either way, I hope you found the video to be an interesting one. Like I said, next week we're going to be watching Made in Abyss, and the week after you have the choice between Link Click or Iroduku, The World in Colors. So be sure to vote on that in the community tab of the channel, and if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like and subscribe for more videos in the future. As always, I want to thank all of the wonderful people over on Patreon who let this channel function. A special shout out goes to our Dai Yokai, Jacob Wiley, our Yokai, Amelia Hellman, Diana Santos, and Ikerochu. And finally, our Hanyo, NL Cruz, Anthony Hogan, Eli Kanem, Kiwi Dog, Michael Greco, Savage Camel, Simon Electric, Stephanie Katz, Suki Neko, Tuesday Brown, and Ziv. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and until next time, remember to stay excellent.